Hey guys, how's it going? My first two Dead Rising videos did really well, so I decided to cover the rest of the franchise. So for starters, Dead Rising 3 is the third main game in the franchise, and this was the beginning of the end for the franchise. That doesn't mean that this game is bad by any means, but this game was not very good by Dead Rising standards. This game utilized a lot of cool concepts, but the main issue that people took from this game was the removal of the franchise's defining characteristics. And today I'm going to go over all of the things that made this game fail in comparison to the likes of Dead Rising 1 and 2. And I'll go over the brief history, the story, the fan reception, should you play in 2024, all the usual stuff that I normally talk about in these videos. But take a walk with me. Let's talk about Dead Rising 3. So, after the success of Dead Rising 2 and Dead Rising 2 Off the Record, Capcom had bought out Blue Castle Games and switched them over to Capcom Vancouver. Keiji Infunane had not given out any hope of a Dead Rising 3 right away. He said that we can't even begin to discuss the possibility of a Dead Rising 3 until we see the sales of Dead Rising 2. But a lot of people already knew that Dead Rising 3 was going to get the green light because so many people were still playing Dead Rising 2. And again, with this video, there really wasn't a lot on the development end because it was kept severely under wraps, but all we do know is that Capcom Vancouver had a lot of big ideas for Dead Rising 3. The main thing they wanted to do was remove loading screens in an open world game, and this is where a lot of problems like miscommunication would set off a chain reaction that would bring the franchise crashing down. A lot of these issues would not start until the development of Dead Rising 4, so we'll discuss that in another video. This game was originally planned for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, but both of these consoles were not strong enough to play these games, especially the PS3, which was basically making the game unplayable. Around this time, Microsoft would start working on an all-in-one entertainment system, and this would eventually become known as the Xbox One. And since Capcom was having trouble trying to keep the game on budget, they made a deal with Microsoft. And Microsoft would invest money into the game and lend some of their developer support. This would give them an extra year in development, but it would make it an exclusive to Xbox. And around this time, Capcom Vancouver would try to pitch new ideas to Capcom, but all of these ideas would be denied because they were too ambitious. And this is where tensions would build within the company. And the founder of Blue Castle Games, Rob Barrett, would step down seemingly out of nowhere. And this would cause a lot of problems after Dead Rising 3. Mainly because the studio was without solid leadership. The game would finally be announced at Microsoft E3, where it was announced that Capcom would be developing the game with Microsoft publishing the title. With Microsoft being a part of this project, it would also explain why we didn't see Dead Rising 3 get the same remaster treatment that the other three games got in the Dead Rising bundle. But Dead Rising 3's announcement and release had a lot of people excited, and it also caused a lot of issues. This game would release with a season pass, and people were sick of the season pass around this point. And they would also release a PC port that would have a ton of performance problems. And this is just the beginning of a lot of the issues with this game. But this is all the information I could dig up about the development and the history behind the game, so I'm just going to move right on into the plot. So this game follows a mechanic named Nick Ramos as he goes through the outbreak in San Perdidos. This game has a much darker tone than any of the other Dead Rising games. So this game starts off with Nick trying to find a way out of a city through one of the quarantine zones, but he ends up in a closed off tunnel that's full of zombies. He has to make a quick escape, and on his way down he smacks his nuts on a fucking street sign and somehow hits the ground without getting killed. When he wakes up, he ends up on the end of a freeway, which right as he starts running from the zombies surrounding him, he watches a full plane of people crash onto the highway, basically causing destruction all over the place. And this is just the opening scene. The opening credits start right after that. Once the credits wrap up, you regain control of Nick, and you head towards the diner where all of his friends are held up at. This is where you meet Rhonda, Annie, and Dick. These people will be the more important people of the story, besides maybe Dick, who's more of a background character like Carver was in Dead Space 3. The other two survivors you meet die almost immediately, and Annie will run off to go survive on her own. Dick accidentally bumps into the record player and attracts a whole horde of zombies, and at this point, Nick and the gang take off to go to Rhonda's garage. Once you arrive there, Rhonda tells you to leave so that she can fix the TV and they can find out what to do next. Nick will leave and he'll pick up a radio that only works one way. Yeah. This is the walkie-talkie where you get your information about the psychopaths and the survivors. And I say survivors in quotes because saving survivors in this game is basically non-existent. After doing some shit out there, you go back to Rhonda's garage and you find out that the government is going to firebomb the city if there are no survivors left in the city. The TV will tell them to head to a government checkpoint, so they head out. And when they arrive at the checkpoint, they find out that everybody at the checkpoint has been killed and it's been taken over by crazy bikers. You end up having to fight the bikers, and once they are defeated, Nick meets up with his old friend Diego, who tells him about a plane that is in a warehouse next to a museum, and all it needs is fuel. After this, Nick gets bitten by a zombie, and he freaks out and goes to the local morgue to get some Zombrex. After running through a giant cemetery, Nick finally arrives at the crematorium where he meets Gary, a suspicious man who's looking for a girl that looks just like Annie. Gary needs help bringing the cadaver to his boss, but before they leave, Nick finds out that the Zombrex supply is gone. Nick, ready to give up, is ready to let Gary shoot him in the head, but Gary slips and fires his last bullet. Yeah. That is so stupid. Anyways, after picking Gary up off the floor, Gary notices that Nick's wound is healing, which has never happened before, unless you played Dead Rising 1 and 2 and have been bitten countless times trying to navigate the zombies, but I guess we'll just leave that alone, I guess. After Nick realizes that he's immune to the infection, Gary has Nick drive the cadaver that looks like Annie over to the strip club where Gary's boss is supposed to pick it up in exchange for some fuel for the plane. After this, Nick watches the TV and sees that the news is falsely reporting that survivors are being evacuated out of the city when they just saw that those evacuation points were overrun and people were killed. After this, Nick meets back up with Rhonda in the group at the warehouse where the plane is being held at. They find out that they need fuel and parts to make the plane work. Nick decides that he's going to go save Annie so Annie can escape the city too. But when he arrives at the safe house where Annie is at, he gets chased by Red and another group member, and the floor breaks and he falls through the floor. After they help him out, he tells them that there is a plane and he needs fuel for it, and Red says that he can get fuel as long as Nick helps them fight back against the military, and this is where Red tells Nick that the military is purposely killing everybody. So in exchange for fuel, he needs to get rid of all of the military equipment that the military is using and get evidence that the military is committing a bunch of crimes. This eventually leads Nick to going to the police station, and he has to fight Hilda, the horniest cop I think I've ever seen in my life. But he gets this evidence that the military is committing all of these crimes and brings it back to Red and Annie. After this, we go to meet Red, and we find out that while Nick was gone, the military came and kidnapped all of the illegals. So now Nick and Red have to go save all of the people that were captured. And this is where we find out that Hemlock and Marion are behind the outbreak, as they infect the president with the virus right in front of him. We finally get all of the illegals and we escape with them. And once they get all in the truck, Gary tries to kidnap Annie but is basically beaten up by Nick.
After this, Nick finds out that the government is paying people $5 billion to bring them the person with the tattoo on their neck, like Nick and Diego. When Nick gets the fuel from Red, he returns to Dick and Rhonda and finds out that Diego has taken the parts of the plane and has gone crazy and left to go to the museum. Nick goes to the museum and confronts Diego and calms him down and takes the parts back for the plane. Once Nick and Diego go to leave, they are captured by the military, and this is where the finale of the game starts. They are both awakened in a room and they are tied down to a chair with a machine that increases the activity of the parasites. They use this to find out that Nick is the immune one, while Diego dies from the parasites exploding out of his body. This allows Nick to escape, who then runs into Isabella Keyes, and this is where she tells him about the immunity. After surviving the attack from Marion,
Nick finds out that Annie has been kidnapped by Gary, and when he goes to Gary, he finds out that Rhonda is Gary's ex-wife. So, in order for Nick to be able to go save Annie, Gary wants him to go find Rhonda. And so Nick goes to Rhonda's garage and finds out that the military has been there and they tortured her and cut off her arm. Nick has to make a makeshift flamethrower arm for Rhonda because for some reason she cares about how she looks, even though she's missing an arm. They'll finally go back to Gary and then they'll walk off into the sunset, acting like a bunch of weirdos. Nick goes in and saves Annie, and they are finally together again, and they go back to the warehouse where the plane is, and this is where we see Isabella Keyes. And she explains that Nick was one of the orphans that Carlito tested on back before the Willamette virus outbreak, in order for them to become biological weapons. But he was the only one that was implanted with a cure. He has to leave town so that his blood can be used for a cure. Interested in the reward for Nick, Red turns on the group and calls the military so that they can come and capture Nick. After Red is crushed by a giant red crate, Nick uses the transceiver, pretending to be an agent, and tells Hemlock that they need more time to apprehend him. So, Hemlock gives them more time, extending the bombings. This is where Chuck Green makes an appearance. It turns out that the whole time, Annie was actually Katie Green, which was kind of crazy when I first got to this point, but, you know, it was also kind of a cheap move. Chuck came so obsessed with finding Katie Zombrex, and, I mean, from Dead Rising 2, I guess you could see why, but Katie ends up running away from home because she felt like a burden to Chuck, and Chuck has been trying to find her for 2 years. Finally, everybody gets piled on the plane except for Rhonda and Gary, who decide to stay behind. They all decide to take off in the plane when they start hearing Hemlock over the radio stating that they're going to create a mass murder weapon or weapon of mass destruction out of all of the king zombies that have appeared throughout the city. Nick stops the plane so that Chuck and Nick can go after General Hemlock and stop his plans. They follow the drones to one of the buildings nearby where General Hemlock and Marion are standing on the roof. General Hemlock tries to make his move on Marion for some reason, and Marion denies him and disrespects him. This pisses off Hemlock, and Hemlock picks her up and throws her off the roof. After this, Nick follows one of the drones and grabs onto the drone, which brings him up into the helicopter where he confronts Hemlock and crashes the helicopter. After this, the final boss fight starts between Hemlock and Nick, where Nick will beat his ass and finally kick him into a helicopter propeller, which will shred him into itty-bitty little pieces. After this, Katie calls Nick on the transceiver and tells him that Chuck and her are on the way. They have to pick up Isabella, who went back to the lab for something. This is where the game ends with a post-credit scene that shows us that Isabella was actually the one behind the outbreak. She did this so she could find the cure and restore her family's name and do right in the history books instead of looking like the villain. And this is where the game completely ends, right here. And I would say this was probably the last game in the franchise that had some fair amount of potential, which is sad because I really liked this game when it came out. I played this way back when it released, and I've played it a couple times since, and the more I play it, the more I start to see all the issues with it. And it's not like this game didn't have likable characters, because, like, I really liked Nick Ramos. I thought he was a very good character for the franchise, but with how bad the story was and what they did with this story, it just completely, you can see where Dead Rising 4 kind of came from. And there's actually a lot that went into Dead Rising 4 that I'm going to talk about in another video. But people hated this game. This game took all of the identity that other games had tried so hard to build up and just completely removed it. This game didn't know whether or not it wanted to be a sandbox zombie survival game or a Dead Rising sequel, but this would just be the beginning of the end for the franchise. Now, I'm going to get into all the things that people did not like about this game. So, this is the reception to the game. This game was hated for so many reasons by a lot of Dead Rising fans. For starters, the time limit was gone, so you could do things without feeling the pressure of being timed, and this is probably one of the biggest sins that this game commits. Even though in Nightmare mode you do get the time limit back, it's still, for the people that want to just play the regular game with the time limit, there's no option for it. And this removed the key feature that this game was known for, and this pissed a lot of fans off. This would be like removing the zombie virus out of a Resident Evil game. It just got so much hate because of this. The next thing that so many people hated were the psychopath bosses. These boss fights were turned into map markers instead of either being a surprise mission or being something that you stumble upon by accident. You didn't really get anything good from these fights either. Maybe a couple of weapons that were actually overpowered, but the other problem was the weapon locker, because this made cheesing the boss fights way too easy and it took the survival out of the game. In all of the other games, you needed to scavenge for parts to make your weapons, and this was absolutely ruined by having this weapon locker. Another big thing was the survivors. This was very limited to a very few survivor escorts that were just a waste of time. And I understand the map size being so big, it's so hard to find a central place to bring the survivors, but they could have figured something out. Just having these survivors was it wasn't even like survivor escorts at this point. You would just clear the zombies that were around them and they'd give you a shitty item and they'd run away. I mean, it's just not fun, and most people when they go back and play this just skip the survivors entirely. And the last big thing that I've already mentioned was the story, of course. This story was so bad. They could have gone anywhere with this story, but of course they ended it in a way that makes the least bit of sense for the next game. If you invent the idea of a cure, how the hell do more zombies keep popping up in future games? Just in a writing perspective, they really dug themselves into a hole that they couldn't save themselves from. And obviously, because Dead Rising 4 ended up being such a massive disaster, Dead Rising 3 was supposed to be an Xbox exclusive, but because of that backlash, they ended up trying to port it to PC. But the performance was so bad that it was basically unplayable. The frame rate kept dropping under 30 FPS and they never released a fix for it, so many people who had bought the game couldn't even play it. Teaming up with Microsoft was probably the worst possible decision that these guys could have made. If they had just spent more time working on the game, I'm sure they would have been able to find fixes for it. But of course, they just went and ruined a good concept. Like I said before, this marked the beginning of the end for the franchise, and this game had so much potential. This game and Dead Rising 4 is generally hated so much among fans. So instead of just giving you what a big IGN review would have looked like, because I'm sure that shit probably was paid off or something, I just figured I'd give you what other fans have told me and what I have seen for myself. The only good thing that came out of this game was bigger zombie hordes and the combo vehicles, because that was actually really cool. There was also more combo weapons that made the game a lot of fun. But that's the fan reception. I'm going to get into whether you should play this in 2024 next. So this next portion is actually a little difficult because in my honest opinion,
if you're playing this game for the first time, I don't see why you shouldn't be able to play this in 2024. I mean, it's on Xbox, so you can go back and play it, but there's really not a lot of replayability. This game does not have as much replayability as the other Dead Rising games, but if you do want to play it just to experience what the game is like, then I say go for it, because the game is not as bad as Dead Rising 4, but it's not any better. If I had to rate this game, it would probably be a 6 out of 10, just because if you're playing it for the first time, then it's a lot of fun. And just learning what each story beat is going to be is very interesting at the time. But looking back on it after playing other Dead Rising games, you're gonna see what I mean when you say it doesn't feel like a Dead Rising game. This feels like something that could have been a totally separate IP and it probably would have passed. But because they slapped the Dead Rising label on it, we get stuck with having to remember this game for what it was. If you go into this expecting like it's going to be all of the other Dead Rising games, then you're going to be extremely disappointed. But that's besides the point. The game removed all of the big features that actually made the game incredible and made the game what it is, so it basically ruins any chance of this game making a comeback in the future. But I know I've already talked about what my final thoughts are, even before the final thoughts section of the video, but I just wanted to get that out there. Let me get into the next part where I wrap things up. If you go into this game expecting that it's going to be like all the other Dead Rising games, then you're going to be extremely disappointed. Besides that, the game removed all of the key features that made this game incredible and basically ruined every chance of this game making a comeback in the future. But let me get into my final thoughts. I know I've already talked about what I think about this game, but let me get into the part where I wrap up the video. At the end of the day, it's really up to you on what you want to play. I like to come back to the franchise every 3 to 4 years just so I can play all the Dead Rising games from beginning to end. And if you're like me, you probably do too. I think this game should have done things differently and should have done things to improve. But they actively chose not to, and that is the real crime here. I've honestly said everything that I've needed to say here, because after this game, the franchise would turn into an absolute dumpster fire. Especially that was Dead Rising 4, and we thought that we wouldn't see anything new from the franchise, and that's until this year, where a remake has been announced for the first Dead Rising game. My hope for the future is that they decide to reboot the franchise and start over from scratch. I believe that so many people would rather that because it would just wipe away the sins of the predecessors. And that's all I've really got to say. I just want to reiterate, I in no way hate this game. I am a huge fan of this franchise, and it just makes me sad to see all of these problems that could have easily have been avoided if Capcom Vancouver actually gave a shit about what the fans loved about the franchise. But that's gonna do it. I want to thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please watch another one because that's how the algorithm works, and if you enjoyed this, maybe it'll recommend it to somebody else who enjoys this kind of content too. I want to thank you all for watching, and have a good night.